What we're doing is trying to help building owners and operators just methodically, slowly, and really smartly reduce their use of fossil fuels.
Welcome to Building Well, Sustainable Homes, Equitable Communities, your new podcast from New Ecology. Join us as we explore real-life stories from key players in green building and community development. We'll examine exciting new innovations, highlighting practical solutions for creating more affordable, healthier, more resilient, equitable communities. We're building well together.
This episode was made possible by the Mass Save Community Education Grant.
Welcome to Building Well, the podcast from New Ecology. My name is Michelle Moran. I will be your host today. I'm joined by my co-host, Alina Michaelevich. She is the Principal Director of Finance here at New Ecology. We are also joined by our guests, Pat Coleman and Marty Jostin. They'll be telling us a little bit about their work in decarbonization and affordable housing. Let's take it away. So welcome, Marty and Pat. Marty, could you please introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Marty. I'm the Principal Director of Building Decarbonization. I have been at New Ecology for over 16 years. So I'm not only the oldest employee, but I've been here the longest at this point. I first started as a part-time consultant. We were developing first of its kind benchmarking tool for multifamily housing. And it's known as WeGo-Wise, and we are no longer involved in WeGo, but I'm glad to say it's still around today and still serving a purpose. I moved on to serving as a senior project manager, where I did a number of things. I helped shepherd through some of New Ecology's very first Enterprise Green Communities projects and did them in places like Mississippi and in Maryland. And the work in Maryland helped us get a toe in the state to begin work there. And we now have had an office there for over 8 years. I most recently served as the Director of Product and Service Development, which was envisioned to be the place where kind of new lines of business and services were incubated at New Ecology, things that we really collectively thought would serve the marketplace. Spent some time working with Pat during that time. Most of my time in the past 5 years or so was spent working on developing and getting out a service on remote monitoring where we were collecting data, real-time data from mostly central HVAC systems and really trying to figure out how to make existing buildings operate more efficiently because we were seeing repeatedly a lot of those savings that we get from a project drop off over time through the operations. So we learned a ton through that project, a lot of really good information, but we decided to shut that service down in January. We still do some monitoring work for our own purposes. And for the past year or so, I've been working to build out our decarbonization division, and that's where the engineering team resides, and we do a lot of building audits. We work with others on research projects. We do building commissioning, things like that. We participate and run some programs like the Energize Delaware program. The engineering team serves that program, as well as the LEAN program here in Massachusetts and Electrify Cambridge. We're also trying to grow kind of our strategic and portfolio services for building owners, and certainly have been involved kind of a little bit ad hoc in workforce development. So we're working hard on that and trying to figure out exactly where our efforts are best applied with teams and on our own in workforce. So I've been really blessed to have a great team here at New Ecology and a long and interesting career here and doing good and important work. So that's what pretty much keeps me coming back year after year.
Thank you, Marty. Pat, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I don't know that I can be as thorough and comprehensive as Marty was, but my name is Pat Coleman. I'm a Principal Director of our Climate Smart Communities division here at New Ecology. I've been with the organization for almost 10 years. I joined the organization, similar to Marty, as a consultant when I moved from Boston to Philadelphia in 2014, where my first job was to work with the Philadelphia Housing Authority and support their efforts to benchmark their portfolio in the WeGo-Wise tool that Marty and others had worked to create. And then I joined the staff of the organization at the beginning of the following year. I've had a couple of different hats at the organization. Early on, I worked for a number of wonderful years under Marty. Marty was my boss. And, we were working on a bunch of different things to try to build demand nationally for energy efficiency and affordable multifamily housing alongside a number of partners, Elevate Energy and others, in coordinating a multi-state benchmarking initiative. We also were developing some tools and services to try to support owners to kind of identify the needs and kind of plan around energy efficiency from a portfolio perspective, which kind of funny, we're now kind of coming full circle there with so much of the IRA and Inflation Reduction Act resources now kind of prompting everybody to focus on where their best opportunities are within their portfolio. New Ecology had the fortunate opportunity in late 2016 to begin work with the Delaware Sustainable Energy Utility. They requested our help to design, launch, and implement a program in Delaware to serve affordable multifamily housing. And so I shifted to work on that initiative, helping to launch and then administer that program. And then in more recent years, have been kind of focusing on trying to define new ecology services and operations to move the needle in terms of sustainability and building performance outside of the regulated affordable multifamily housing space. So more in what's called naturally occurring affordable housing, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. So, my team is pretty small at New Ecology, small but mighty. And, we manage programs, we run some projects, and again, a lot of the focus is trying to advance the organization's mission in those unregulated housing sectors and a little bit kind of closer collaboration with community-based organizations.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for that overview. Marty, I know that you gave us a brief overview, but would you please give us more detailed information on what exactly decarbonization is, why it's important, like why I should care?
Be happy to. So decarbonization is essentially the process of weaning a building off of its use of fossil fuel, its need for fossil fuel, typically over time. So a lot of people think of it as equivalent to electrification, but that's not entirely true. Efficiency is a form of decarbonization, right? It's our way to get people to use less fossil fuels in their building. And ideally, it also is including the adoption of renewables can further reduce the use of the grid, which is heavily dependent itself on fossil fuels at the moment. So what we're doing is trying to help building owners and operators just methodically, slowly, and really smartly reduce their use of fossil fuels. There's really, there's so many studies that speak to the importance of this work and just a lot of opinion out there. But, essentially, there's not too much disagreement in the public sphere about the fact that the climate's changing. We're all experiencing really kind of epic weather on a more frequent basis. So that's why we're doing this work. There's a lot of buildings in the country. Buildings have been identified over and over again as a leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why we do this work. The other part of this is, doing this work and the urgency of this work enables us to get some other things right in a building that might not be right. My team works only in existing buildings, and there's just a lot that can go south over time in these buildings. There's always deferred maintenance. A lot of times affordable housing is constructed in old buildings that are in rough shape to begin with, right? So we're trying to take this moment in time, and actually every time we interact with the building team, to really correct some of those things and to make sure we're really thinking hard about the health and safety of the residents, the comfort of those residents, the resiliency of the building so that they can shelter in place during a weather event. And with the operations teams, I've spent enough time working with operations teams to know that they've got pretty demanding and chaotic lives. So they're usually in a posture of just responding to some emergency or some chaos. So trying to put them in a better place just in their day-to-day job and their ability to keep that building efficient, healthy, safe, comfortable.
I have some follow-up questions. First one is, our last episode, we talked a lot about new construction, and you were talking about existing buildings. Can you talk a little bit about why it's so important for us to focus on existing buildings as well as new construction? There's many existing buildings. And
there's a whole lot more existing buildings. That's why it's, in some respects, I kind of tease the new construction folks that, that they've got the easy job and we've got the hard job. There's something to be said about having a clean sheet of paper when you're starting work on a building. Of course, it's not that simple, but there's a lot of things that are driving people to better, healthier buildings from a new construction standpoint. It's just a lot harder from an existing building standpoint because, there's so many different types of buildings you're dealing with from one day to the next. There's so much that's happened in that building over time by so many different actors, contractors and HVAC companies, that you're really going in there and unraveling a puzzle a lot of times. There's a lot of time that has to go into how is this building operating now and what's wrong now and what are the parts I can't change in this upgrade process, right? Where's my starting point here? Because I can only go so far. So it's interesting, but challenging in that regard.
You have to be pragmatic and prioritize. It sounds like where new construction, you can dream a little, perhaps, depending on the financing of the situation, but you can kind of make it however you want. But you go into an existing building and you're already restricted just by what's in place.
Yeah, there's just typically a lot more money, right, for the new construction process. That's why it happens on a slower cycle. And when we go to a building, we also have to think about the types of residents in the building, how the building's used now, what's the capacity of the operations staff. So there's just a lot of those kinds of pieces you have to do, investigate all of the maintenance requests that they've gotten. There's just a lot of that kind of homework to get to know the building before you even start.
Yeah, that's cool. You talked about decarbonization and its connection to climate change. And I know you, so I know you're very passionate about climate change and decarbonization, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what gets you most excited about coming to work.
There's a lot of things, actually.
That's good.
I mentioned it earlier. One thing that gets me excited is being able to lead a team that's equally as passionate. And that really, everyone that we work with here, they're just givers and they are smart and they keep me on my toes, so that's really good. And I don't pretend to know as much as many of them, I'm kind of good at being the conductor. It's very rewarding. On the other side, I feel that I'm good at being a conductor and I'm good at getting the most out of others, and that this is a team that really can solve a lot of problems. And we get to do that on so many levels. We get to do it on the ground level with the buildings and the owners and the residents to some degree. And then we get to kind of pull out into the workforce and the education piece. And then we can, we work in the policy realm, and then we take what we know and we get to bring it to a national audience. So all of that's it's very rewarding. And there's just enough, zig and zag and all of it that it just keeps it very fresh and interesting.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'd like to hear the same from Pat, if you don't mind.
What gets you up in the morning, Pat?
It's usually either the dog or my 4-year-old. But then after that, I would echo a number of the comments that Marty made. I think that the team that is at New Ecology has always been exceptional. And so the opportunity to work with people with such diverse experiences and expertise, and the kind of mission elements of what we do aligns really closely with my personal beliefs and kind of how I want to spend my time. The reason I work on buildings is because I'm kind of impatient, and not that things necessarily happen quickly on our projects. Some of them take many years, but there's something very satisfying about being able to see the concrete change in a physical space and feeling like we're able to help provide family with a stable and safe and comfortable home is very satisfying for me. And I would also say, like, again, back to kind of the team, is like people are pretty tenacious and they're not afraid to take on difficult challenges here. We face a lot of serious problems as a society and as a world, and we're not going to solve all of them here at New Ecology, but like people are encouraged and take on pretty ambitious projects. And sometimes we end up working with partners who think that we're crazy. And I mean, on Friday, I heard of a story from a colleague who talked about being in a meeting with a partner on one of our projects who a year ago, I think, did not find us particularly helpful, and has come full circle and, you know, kind of appreciated the role that New Ecology has played to create a better set of homes for a group of families. So that's very satisfying, and kind of, you know, it's nice to have a little win here and there. Like, all right, we got one more rowing in the same direction.
It's always nice to have a little win, especially in this industry, right? I would just like to follow up a little bit, since we've been talking a lot about decarbonization and the intricacies of it. We used some terms earlier that I'd like to define better. One is commissioning and one is benchmarking. What is commissioning and benchmarking, and why is it important to decarbonization?
So commissioning is a standard process of most new construction projects, where it's really the guarantee the owner has that the formal process has been followed to make sure all the systems are functioning properly, and, you know, that the design intent is met to some degree, and things like that. So it's a pretty standard process for new construction. There's also retro commissioning, where a similar type thing is done on part or entire building for an existing building. More often now, there's sort of this concept of continuous commissioning or monitoring based commissioning, where you're really using data from some type of a system like the one we used to operate to collect real-time operational data that then you can use to alert maintenance when things are operating in an out-of-spec condition, or you can download that data later for analysis and make recommendations. So it's just really keeping the eyes either at a point in time on the operation, or my preference is over time to help those facility managers. So that would be the continuous commissioning idea.
And the idea of benchmarking is very simply is just to kind of track performance over time. So, you know, when we talk about benchmarking building performance, usually what we're doing is we're collecting and combining two different data sets, one being the physical characteristics of the subject buildings and the other being, say, the utility performance metrics associated with that building. You know, we combine those data sets and then we can get an understanding of how that building is performing, whether it's, you know, just looking at kilowatt hours or gallons of water consumed every month, or running metrics like energy use intensities of, you know, BTUs of energy used per square foot. And when you normalize it in that way, you can enable comparisons to other buildings. So maybe you're running some benchmarking exercises to see how does building A compare to building B. Maybe you're running a comparison of how this building A compared to the entire portfolio of properties that may be under somebody's ownership or management. Maybe it's a comparison of those buildings, one or many of those buildings, against a national benchmark, some external standard. But basically the idea is you're tracking performance and giving a directional sense of how am I doing? Am I performing better, worse, or at some particular benchmark? Usually, you know, again, back to kind of the portfolio perspective, in terms of decarbonization or energy efficiency projects, you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck if you go after the worst performers. So that's oftentimes a helpful way to get a sense of where you might want to start.
That was the reason behind the creation of WeGoWise way back in the day, is that there was a push because multifamily housing was being sort of left out of the energy efficiency programs. It wasn't really considered residential. It wasn't really considered commercial. So it was just this thing that was being ignored. And there was enough pushback on that it enabled things like, conversations around, well, how should these buildings be performing? And nobody could answer that question. So we said, you know what, we'll figure it out. We'll start collecting this data. And then that turned into, doing this with spreadsheets is just god awful, as much as I love spreadsheets, but it just was hard and messy. And so then that turned into a platform that could be applied and available to others nationally. And that's how you get some of those benchmarks that Pat was talking about, that large volume of buildings, all that data feeding into what those benchmarks can be. So it's pretty powerful stuff. And this was before Energy Star Portfolio Manager existed. So yeah, it was good.
I didn't realize that the multifamily had been left out. That's interesting.
It had been, yeah.
It sounds like back when this stuff was first being established, data collection was important because you didn't really have any concept of what was going on in affordable or multifamily housing. And now it's equally important because of all these efforts that we're trying to do with decarbonization and maybe even the Inflation Reduction Act funding and stuff like that. So it's just as important now as it was when we first started all of this stuff. And I assume will continue to be.
Yeah, you're right.
Marty, since you were just talking about some of these topics, I'd like to ask you, what are the drivers, if any, that are encouraging property owners, especially of affordable multifamily housing, to move towards decarbonization work?
Depends on where you are, but like anything else, there's carrots and sticks. So you always want to start off with the incentives, but that isn't always enough. In the state of Massachusetts, we're very lucky in that we have had and continue to have really robust incentives and funding for all kinds of things. We have the LEAN program, which is directed specifically at multifamily affordable housing. It has long been a reason to get people to do things in their buildings, to improve, replace equipment with higher efficiency equipment, do air sealing insulation and things like that. And it's been a very generous program. There's also, the state and Mass CEC, the Clean Energy Center, has different programs that are targeting sort of different things that people want to learn in the industry. It might be focused on equipment. It might be a pilot. They actually helped fund the startup of our remote monitoring work, that early investigation work that we did. So they're always, looking to push the envelope a little and learn more about buildings and how they can work better. And then in Maryland, say, where our other office is in the Mid-Atlantic, you don't have those same kind of incentives. There's fewer incentives and there's fewer sticks. There's less regulation. So it's a lot harder to get some of this work going. Some of the things are really, it's regulatory. And we learned early on that unless you make people do things, they're not likely going to do it, right? There's just a lot going on. And being able to say, okay, these are the performance standards you need to meet. So here in Massachusetts and in Boston, specifically, there's BERDO, the Building Emissions Reporting and Disclosure Ordinance. So that takes buildings of all different types, multifamily being one of those types, and says, you need to reduce your overall emissions per square foot over time to 2050. So those types of ordinances are growing in number. They can be local, they can be statewide, they can, there's national benchmarking coming. So there's all of that kind of stuff is just growing for people, providing more impetus for doing some work now and figuring out what you need to do now.
Welcome back. I'm Molly with your Mass Save Minutes. Today we're diving into Mass Save's incentives for multifamily residential projects. The Multifamily Retrofit Program offers incentives for housing that includes 5 units or more. The incentives can be applied to upgrades like efficient lighting, HVAC systems, and insulation. These upgrades not only cut utility bills, but also improve residents' comfort. For developers, the new construction program provides incentives to integrate energy-efficient features from the start. This includes advanced insulation, high-efficiency heating and cooling systems, and LED lighting, reducing long-term operational costs. MassSave also provides technical assistance, simplifying the process for property owners and developers to access these incentives and maximize savings. If you're interested in the Passive House certification, MassSave also offers various Passive House certification incentives. Whether retrofitting existing buildings or starting new projects, MassSave's programs offer tangible benefits, making energy efficiency a win-win for multifamily residential projects in Massachusetts. Head over to the MassSave website at masssave.com, MassSave.com to learn more. That's it for today's MassSave Minute. Thanks for joining us. Remember, MassSave isn't just for single-family homeowners. Go check out their website for programs offered to multifamily projects too. Until next time, stay informed and energy conscious.
I guess I would say that there's two primary drivers of decarbonization or, high performance buildings. If we're just thinking about kind of a policy or programmatic field, taking the, operators out of the equation for a moment in terms of their individual goals. And as Marty said, like first and foremost, the most efficient thing is a regulation that just requires somebody to do X. And then secondly, the incentives are certainly helpful to enable people to achieve more ambitious targets. But the third thing I would add is, especially in the affordable housing space and in underserved markets, an enabling element that is critical is the provision of technical assistance so that people know what to do if we're asking them to achieve these really ambitious building performance goals, whether it's a new construction project or a decarbonization project. Even those of us that own our own homes oftentimes don't really know how to take care of them. And so if we're asking the general public to achieve these more ambitious goals, some of which are very, very new, right? We're looking at massive decreases in the energy usage of the properties. It's not reasonable to expect that most owners and operators of those properties know how to get there, and they need help to be able to do that. And, I would just flag that New Ecology has had a really fortunate opportunity of working alongside some of the country's largest and most sophisticated owners of affordable multifamily housing.
We work for a lot of large owners and operators, and even they are struggling with knowing exactly what they should do and where they should do it first. And, we're still learning. There's enough change right now that we're still learning and forming opinions about that. And, Pat's exactly right on the technical assistance part. We've been fortunate, we're a nonprofit, so we can apply for grant funding, and we often do apply for grant funding that we can then turn around and make available to our clients and people that we work with to get things done, to help get them started along a journey with a building or a portfolio.
What might that technical assistance consist of?
More and more, actually, and especially in other parts of the country that are not as far along, it's sitting them down and really going through their portfolio with them. It's like a methodical, logical process, as Pat mentioned earlier, to kind of like marry some of their building characteristics and what we know about their operation with their utility data historically. And then, that enables us to, it just starts a conversation. We're able to graph that information. We're able to, use it to probe a little further on certain buildings or building types. And it gets that conversation going that helps them start to understand how we're thinking about it. We're helping build capacity a little bit of that organization. And then it just leads naturally to some planning of next steps, because you can't do a lot with what we do at that stage other than plan, okay, so here's what you should do next. And that can include helping them do the audit work. We get a lot of grant funding that helps subsidize our audit work. It can help find funds for them, help them do things that produce certain outputs that help them apply for grants for their own funding. So kind of we try to have that technical assistance be what they need. And if it's not something we do, we try to make those connections for them.
So it's like connecting the reality of the building to the energy bills and understanding how those two things are actually related, like why one is causing the other.
Exactly.
What different kinds of audits are there?
An energy audit, a lot of times we're looking at efficiency, we're looking at strictly at consumption, where a decarb audit, it's about the carbon. We're looking not only at efficiency and what comes with efficiency, but it's also understanding the impact, in particular when in Massachusetts, say, when you decarbonize a building and you're electrifying it as a step, you are drastically increasing the cost to that owner, possibly the residents of that, because you're going from a cheaper fuel to a more expensive fuel. So then the only way for it to make sense is that you have to look on how do we significantly address the envelope and lower the load of this building. And that gets into some very expensive retrofits. So there's a lot more options and trade-offs and considerations for how you approach things from a decarbonization standpoint versus kind of the more energy efficiency standpoint, where a lot of the utility program, utility grade audits, we call them, is just, you're looking for specific things that fit within the program. Decarb audit, you're looking at a lot more measures, and then you're trying to look at them over time. And what's a logical sequence for implementing those measures from a cost perspective, from a carbon impact perspective, from a compliance perspective, if you've got a building standard you're trying to meet. It's a more detailed view and a more strategic thinking about the results. You're not coming up with a list of things. You're coming up with really a strategy that you need to apply over time.
Okay, and then to dig into two things that you said, lowering the load, that's making the appliances more efficient, and lowering the usage.
It's when I say load, I'm sorry, I talk about, it's like, how much energy does it take to heat this building, to cool this building, to ventilate this building? So needing to bring that way down as you are going from, a gas system to a more expensive electric system within Massachusetts. It's less of an issue in the Mid-Atlantic. They've got buildings that are already all electric, which they may not be efficient, but they're all electric, so then you're looking more at efficiency. But here and in colder climates, it's a big deal. There's a lot you need to address with the envelope.
And the envelope would be air sealing.
Yep. It's the air sealing, it's the insulation, it's the windows, it's the basement, it's the roof, all of that. You're just trying to minimize that exchange of air and the loss of heat. It's energy recovery as part of the ventilation strategy. So there's a lot of things you can do, and it's just hard to afford all of them. They can be expensive.
So the energy audit's looking at the energy efficiency of the building, but the decarb audit is looking at all of those things that we just talked about holistically.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great deal of overlap in the things you're looking at, but the difference is in how you implement them. You're really thinking about the cost of these measures, and you have to think about at what point do we get off gas entirely or oil, and do we jump over to electricity? There's just a lot that goes into those decisions. It could be the cost of those individual measures. It could be how old the equipment is at the point of time that you're looking at it. How long do you want to keep that running? It could be what funding is available to do what now. Do you add solar early on because there's tax credits now? And therefore you have to do your roof early to be able to support the solar, or do you do it kind of in a logical timing? Well, we'll add the solar once our, roof reaches its end of useful life in 5 years, So there's just all of those kinds of decisions that an owner needs to make, and then we try to help them navigate based on their own goals.
That's cool.
Pat, could you please tell us what is affordable housing? What are the different types, and what exactly we mean by NOAA? You had mentioned this NOAA term earlier, and you had promised us more information on it.
I will do my best. I mean, there are shelves of books written about what affordable housing is, but we're talking about housing that is affordable to lower and moderate income households. And so when you look at kind of the federal programs to support housing affordability, I'm going to be very simplistic, but there's kind of two main categories, right? There is the public housing, where we're talking about housing that was built and is operated by a public housing authority, a public entity. And then there is a large portion of housing that is privately owned, but is subsidized or financed in some way through some sort of government housing program. And so we'll often refer to that as, privately owned and subsidized housing. Both of those kinds of housing are oftentimes categorized as affordable multifamily housing. Most of the projects that New Ecology serves are in that privately owned and subsidized affordable housing category. So those would be properties with project-based Section 8 contracts or a HUD-assisted or insured mortgage or low-income housing tax credit project. The naturally occurring affordable housing, it's not really the best term for it, but it's the term that is often used as the go-to to define housing that lower moderate income people live in, but is not regulated or subsidized in any way. If you look at affordable housing nationally, the unregulated stock is about 80% of affordable housing. And that stat came from our friends Elevate in Chicago. And they combined a couple of different data sets and ran some analyses trying to look at the housing units and census tracts where the housing costs are no more than 30% of 80% of the area median income as a metric of kind of a cutoff of housing affordability. There are differences, within different regions of the country. So whereas, this unregulated affordable housing stock may be 30% nationwide, if you look at mid-Atlantic cities, Philadelphia, Wilmington, Baltimore, it's more like 80 to 90% of the housing stock in those cities. Nationally, those properties would tend to be kind of smaller multifamily properties. But again, in a mid-Atlantic region, they tend to be single-family attached row homes.
I do have a follow-up question. You mentioned in the Mid-Atlantic, a lot of them are single-family attached. Can you just talk a little bit about the difference between multifamily and single-family? We talked a lot about multifamily earlier in the episode, but I don't know that we've defined sort of what that might look like housing stock-wise.
Sure. Again, they're often not really firm definitions other than like it's more than multifamily be more than one unit, right? So you could categorize a 2-unit home as multifamily. In the world of energy efficiency programs, usually properties that have 5 or more units would be considered multifamily. But it's kind of hard to understand how units or properties with 2, 3, or 4 units are not multifamily. But anyway, anybody that's visited the Mid-Atlantic region has seen just the blocks and blocks and blocks of single-family attached row homes that we have. Our cities were largely built out in the late 19th and early 20th century with that very common housing typology is worker housing to work in the many factories. It's not that other cities don't have it, right? I mean, Boston, New York, there are brownstones, but kind of the single family attached typology, if you look at the public data sets, just dominates here. And, comparing it to Boston, if you look at the proportion of Boston's housing stock that are triple deckers, which is like the quintessential Boston housing stock, and you look at the proportion of housing units in mid-Atlantic cities that are single-family row homes, like that single-family row home typology is double what triple deckers are in Boston. So it's just what we have. It's not the only thing we have, but it's what we have. In terms of housing density, like there's some differences between these regions. So Boston tends to have more multifamily, like there's greater density of multifamily properties in Boston than there are, say, in Philadelphia. So there's just regional differences.
Speaking on those regional differences, Pat, are there maybe more challenges or different challenges to decarbonizing this affordable housing in the Mid-Atlantic?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, the thing that comes to mind, if you just think about the building typologies, and I'm sure Marty has a bunch of thoughts on this too, because it's most of what her team thinks about day in and day out, is, in terms of cost per unit, it's a lot more affordable to implement energy efficiency or decarbonization measures where we've got more units in a building. And there's the associated challenges that just kind of come with it, right? I mean, you can look at a block of 20 row homes that are all independently owned. And so the transaction costs of dealing with each individual property are just so much higher than if you're going into a property that has 50 units. It's all owned by one entity. That's a lot more challenging to deal with than if you're working with one owner or one manager that is making decisions for a 50-unit building.
How do the energy savings compare?
It's complicated, right? So, I think one of the things that kind of surprised New Ecology when we moved down and started doing more work in the Mid-Atlantic was the longer payback terms of the mechanical system replacements, right? How long does it take to pay back the replacement of a very costly heating system?
Oh, because they're using less.
Because we use
per
less
year.
because it's not as cold here. Now, on the other hand, our utility costs are different. And particularly around the decarbonization and electrification, in the electrification space, right? The real critical difference between Massachusetts and a lot of the states down here are how costly electricity is. So our electric rates are 12 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour compared to Massachusetts at, I'm not sure anymore, 25, 30 cents.
It's so, yeah.
Whoa,
Yeah.
I didn't
It's
know that.
much more expensive here.
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, so those are kind of like some of the factors that make things different in terms of just how do you put together a package of a project. But then zooming out further, I mean, there are just really different policy and programmatic environments here. And, Massachusetts has 30 years of programming on energy efficiency, large scale energy efficiency programming. And again, I live in Pennsylvania, and it's just different, right? Like at the end of the month is Memorial Day. I'm going camping in Carbon County. We are the second or third largest gas producing state in the country.
Mm.
For Massachusetts, I worked for the state energy office for a couple of years, and a lot of the energy efficiency, the drive towards energy efficiency was a economic development goal for the state, right? To not send resources purchasing fossil fuels across the state border. That's different in a state like Pennsylvania. That's not to say that there aren't good programs and good opportunities in the Mid-Atlantic. Marty already talked about some of the programs in Maryland and DC. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, we manage a couple programs actually for the Delaware Sustainable Energy Utility and their Energize Delaware programs that offer really great incentives and technical assistance services to help people implement ambitious energy efficiency projects.
That's really interesting. I've worked here 2 years, and this is the first time I'm understanding this, that there's a huge savings difference, right? So the driver in the Mid-Atlantic is not dollars saving as much as it is in Mass because the energy costs less there. So then the driver has to be something else. That's very interesting.
All of this work, whether we're talking decarbonization or passive house new construction, I mean, it is hyperlocal. These projects happen and succeed and fail based upon the local circumstances and the partners. And you really have to have boots on the ground and people that can navigate and work well with partners.
Yeah, that's why a lot of the talk and the push about we need to be able to do this stuff at scale. It's like, yeah, but, there's just so much devil in the details, as they say. There's a lot to figure out in each and every place that we operate before we can become a trusted partner to provide that technical assistance to, there's just a lot of that kind of work that has to get done as well.
Pat, do you see any differences or things that might be more challenging for NOAA versus traditional multifamily housing?
By definition, what we're working on here when we're talking about housing that is occupied by lower moderate income households is there's not a lot of money available to pay for capital upgrades, just by definition, right? Like the revenue streams associated with these properties, whether they're owner occupied or rental properties, are limited. And so an owner's ability to invest in more energy efficient mechanical equipment or doing comprehensive air sealing and insulation work, even if it's very cost effective, is just limited by definition. Whereas there are many, I wouldn't say enough, right? There's a lot of low income households that do not have any affordable housing, but there are a number of programs and financing products that are available to serve the affordable multifamily housing space that create kind of systems and structures and cycles to be able to serve those properties. And they create processes like people going in and doing inspections to make sure that properties are meeting certain conditions. And they create opportunities for people to come back in to resyndicate their tax credits every 20 or 30 years and get a new infusion of capital to upgrade their properties. And those realities just don't exist in the world of, naturally occurring affordable housing. So oftentimes, if you're going into an occupied home, you will find very serious problems that nobody's inspecting for. No inspector is coming and making sure that there's not a leak in the roof. They just happen and people can't pay for them. And before we can get to the energy efficiency or the decarbonization measures, we need to deal with those first. And we don't have, by and large, the same level of funding and financing products to enable people to pay for those kinds of upgrades. So, what it really calls for is we need an all hands on deck approach, right? There's a need to kind of wed together the energy efficiency or building performance programs with home repair programs. And there's some successful models that are emerging. Philadelphia, their energy authority, has a Built to Last program, and the state of Pennsylvania a couple of years ago passed a statewide home repair program that is getting off the ground now. And so there's some really great opportunities on the horizon. But doing this work at scale in housing that doesn't have the structures and programmatic framework to enable investment makes it really challenging and calls for greater attention and investment from the public and philanthropic sectors.
On that line, Pat, you can start, but I'd like to hear from both of you. You've touched on this, but we haven't really gotten into it. What are the workforce development needs that you're seeing in your area in either NOAA or multifamily affordable housing? Is there enough workforce to get this work done that we are wanting to get done?
Not right now.
There's needs everywhere. Yeah. I mean, I would say that trades over the past decade or more had just been declining in general, right? The electricians and plumbers and construction folks, I'm happy to see that that's less the case now. It's growing in strength, and there's a lot of trade schools that are really embracing the need for that kind of education again. So that's all positive. And the really positive part about that is that I'm starting to learn of places that are really embracing building into their programs the needs of the decarbonization future, right? To make sure they've got some of those skills in that building science foundation. So that's where we like to work, is like really helping define what that is. What are the things they need to know? Just making sure that young engineers have some of this foundational information. The comparison I always draw is that, people graduate from med school and they just really don't know that much. They don't understand functional medicine, for instance. So what we do is really functional medicine for building. It's really looking at the root cause, comprehensive look, et cetera. And people aren't really trained that way so much. So that's what the need is, to really understand how all the pieces fit together. We can do training. There's lots of programs on training specific tasks and functions within the industry, but there needs to be this kind of higher level of understanding and pulling all those pieces together. But you're right, Pat, there's like needs at every level right now.
Somebody should start a podcast about this.
I really like that term, functional medicine for buildings. That's very good.
I guess another point I would just emphasize, and from the perspective of the kinds of projects that our team is working on and smaller projects, is the need to provide more accessible training to the general public around building performance and energy efficiency and decarbonization.
Mm.
Again, the bigger projects have a lot of requirements associated with them. And that tends to mean that there are larger contractors that are working on those projects that have the experience, have the training, have seen this before in one place or another, or seen something like it.
Mm.
But outside of that environment, smaller projects or home repair projects, you tend to get smaller contractors, smaller subcontractors, smaller tradespeople that are working on those projects. And they may never have been asked to do the kinds of things that we're asking them to do in, say, a project that is trying to meet near passive house level standards or a super insulated wall assembly in an existing masonry structure in a vacant building that's been abandoned for 20 years. There's a lot of people that make their living doing smaller projects. And, if we're going to have wide scale adoption of high performance building practices and decarbonization projects, like the education and the outreach effort really needs to be broad and wide to engage folks like that.
Mm.
Then just one other element I've mentioned before is making sure people know how to operate and maintain things going forward. So our data collection days, we learned over and over and over again how many things can go wrong in a building. Rule of thumb kind of old school thinking that didn't necessarily serve the building well long term. It may have solved an immediate problem, but it didn't get at the cause. Back to the functional medicine thing. It didn't determine the root cause of something. It just stuck a Band-Aid on it. So making sure that people really know how to operate buildings has long been a need, and even more so now as we're introducing new kinds of technologies and more sensor driven things in some cases, just a level of complexity in some cases, and even some new services, ventilation systems that weren't there before, and all of that. So just trying to make sure people know what to do with all that equipment to keep it operating properly and maintaining it, so we don't end up back in this, spot of these poorly maintained buildings that are providing a really vital function of healthy housing.
I had an anecdote on that one. Just 1 or 2 weeks ago, we had one of the engineers come back from doing an audit and talking with a site maintenance person who shared that he was planning to go through this property and rewire the exhaust fans in all of the units because they were running continuously, which he thought was wrong. And that's actually what they were intended to do. But, this individual has just never been given the training on, no, this is actually what the design is. And it's critically important to maintain that level of ventilation so that you don't have some bigger problems down the road when you're not able to get that hot, humid air out of that unit as intended.
Well, I know we're short on time. I think there's so much here. I'd be interested to have a whole nother episode on workforce development. I think I'm also really interested in this statewide home repair programs, or just home repair as a concept as it relates to building capital in underserved communities.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. I think we're about at the end of our time. Just as a closeout, if either of you have any closing thoughts or takeaways, or any information about how an owner or an occupant can go about beginning decarbonization in their buildings.
Well, the last one I'm going to say, call us, because that's all we have time for. But, there are a lot of resources coming out now. There's a lot of regulatory drivers emerging. And with the federal resources in particular coming out, there's a real kind of headlong rush to get on this. And I guess a bit of caution is that we are moving so quickly in some cases that we really need to be thinking ahead, thinking about what we're doing that might be causing harm in these buildings, the decisions we're making now quickly and what that impact is. And just a couple super quick examples, one, refrigerants that we're installing in buildings now that are being phased out by the EPA because of their own global warming potential. There's reason to take a breath on that in some cases. Anyway, Pat, I'll let you answer.
And just echoing some of Marty's comments there, I think that taking a moment to just pause and come up with a plan is critically important. And thinking about, say you're the one that gets to call the shots in this building, which, is an unfortunate reality of many of the rental properties that we serve, is that tenants have very limited ability to determine what happens to the homes in which they live. But, if you are in the position of being able to determine what happens in a building, just think a little bit about your own goals for that property over the next 10, 20 years is not that far. And, what the building needs. So, Marty was bringing up before, like the linkage between installing a solar system at the point of putting a new roof on, right? Like you don't want to really get those things out of sequence because it can be a lot more costly and complicated and frustrating if you get it wrong. Every building is a special snowflake, so everyone needs its own distinct plan, but they all need a plan if we're to hit our climate objectives.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Building Well from New Ecology. I'd like to thank my co-host, Alina Michaelevich, and our guests, Pat Coleman and Marty Jostin. For more information on New Ecology, please see our website, newecology.org. You can also find us on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at New Ecology Inc. Information for this episode will be shared in the show notes on your player or on our New Ecology website, newecology.org/buildingwell-podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.
This episode was made possible by the Mass Save Community Education Grant.